new solution, or a new species of cruelty. Quiet room, a gurney, a restrained man still. A needle is pushed into his arm. First, a dose to render him unconscious, then a second to paralyze his body, and finally, a third dose, a lethal one, that kills his heart. It's a doctor's word, one that clings to the serene. But if I were to inform you, lethal injection, so-called humane method of killing, is also tainted by botched executions, agonizing deaths, and court battles. Imagine me saying to you, some men awoke in the middle of the execution. This is America's gory history of lethal injection, and why we may not so painless after all. For decades, the U.S. had been attempting to kill humanely. Hanging was inconsistent, sometimes swift, sometimes slow and agonizing. The electric chair was pretty, but actually made killings into gruesome public spectacles, with prisoners burning at the stake or receiving multiple jolts before dying. The 1920s added gas chamber wasn't without problems either. Victims would choke for a number of minutes before dying. By the 1970s, the death penalty was unstable. The Supreme Court had temporarily suspended executions in 1972 as being too cruel and capricious. So when the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, states needed a new solution, one that seemed sanitized, painless, and medical. The solution? Lethal injection. In 1977, an Oklahoma medical examiner named J. Chapman proposed a simple three-drug recipe. 1. Sodium thiopental, an anesthetic to render the individual unconscious. 2. Pancuronium bromide, a muscle paralytic to paralyze the body and end breathing. 3. Potassium chloride, a finishing dose to end the heart. The method of execution was simple. The inmate would sleep and pass away peacefully, like having a pet euthanized at the vet. Texas led the charge to implement the procedure, and on December 7, 1982, the U.S. performed its first lethal injection execution. Charles Brooks, Jr., a convicted killer. The death was routine. No burned flesh, no seizure, just tranquil, systematic dispatch. But lethal injection was always touted as flawless equipment. Painless. Look, but is it deadly? Injection. The process hinges on perfect application of 3 chemicals. Something breaks down, and the prisoner can be writhing in agony, but is unable to scream. That's the grim truth. If the initial drug, the tranquilizer, fails, the prisoner is conscious, but completely paralyzed. The third drug, potassium chloride, tastes burning when administered intravenously, though no one would ever be able to determine whether the paralytic had been administered, because no one would have any idea if the prisoner was silently screaming. Some take longer than 30 minutes to complete, and the prisoners struggle to breathe, convulse, and struggle in pain. One of the most gruesome examples, Clayton Lockett's 2014 execution. Lockett was strapped to the gurney, administered the IV of the first drug, but something was wrong. The IV had not been correctly placed, and the drugs dripped into his tissue instead of his veins. He awoke. He struggled for 43 minutes, gritting his teeth, rolling over, even trying to talk. Officials panicked and eventually halted the execution, but he suffered a heart attack a few minutes later, and he wasn't alone. In total, over 7% of lethal injection executions have been botched since the practice began, a higher failure rate than the electric chair, gas chamber, or even the firing squad. With so many ugly cases, it was only a matter of time before people started questioning whether or not lethal injection was really humane. By the early 2000s, lethal injection was the #1 form of execution in America, but the more badly botched ones that made headlines, the more lawyers, doctors, and human rights organizations objected. The tide turned most spectacularly in 2008 in the Supreme Court case Bays versus Reese. 2 death row inmates claimed lethal injection was an 8th Amendment cruel and unusual punishment abuse. The Supreme Court ruled they were unconstitutional, that states could try to ease pain, and that lethal injection was constitutional. But the crisis was not over yet. Another crisis arose. Drug shortages. Pharmaceutical companies, mostly in Europe, refused to sell execution drugs to America. Without the original 3-drug cocktail, states went back to new, untested drugs. The result? More botched executions. 2014, Joseph Wood received 15 doses of test drugs and expired almost 2 hours later, gasping the whole time. 2018, Doyle Lee Ham hemorrhaged into his muscles following a series of botched IV attempts as officials grappled to find a vein. 2022, Alabama was unable to execute 2 prisoners because they were unable to get the IV lines in. By the 2000s, lethal injection was no longer the neat, orderly procedure that it was intended to be. And now, some states are looking for a new option. Because lethal injection failed, some states have brought back older procedures. South Carolina brought back the firing squad. Tennessee and Florida still allow the electric chair. Arizona is reconsidering cyanide gas once more. And to others, appalling. Some death penalty supporters think lethal injection needs to be abolished, not because it's brutal, but because it's not all that trustworthy. Meanwhile, increasingly, Americans are questioning capital punishment altogether. The U.S. is among the final Western nations to retain the death penalty. Since 1973, at least 190 death row prisoners have been exonerated. They were falsely convicted of murder and put to death for a crime they did not commit. And the last question of all, is there really a humane way to kill a human being? Last word, what this means now. Lethal injection was to be the final solution to the death penalty question, and it's become one of the most botched methods of execution in the history books. It compels us to face an unpleasant reality. No matter how hard we work to make it seem sanitary, taking a life is always executing. So what do you think? Is lethal injection a practice that needs to be ended? Should the U.S. even use the death penalty? The argument isn't settled, and the future of capital punishment is in the balance